Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ashley Armstrong. I am the Assistant Librarian at the Center for Popular Music at Middle Tennessee State University. I am so happy to welcome you to our conversation today about legendary rock artist Jimi Hendrix. We are thrilled to have Dr. Mike Alleyne and Katie Rainge-Briggs joining us today. But first, for those of you not familiar with the Center for Popular Music, we are an archive with a small library that supports the research of American popular music. And we don't mean just top 40 music, but rather all music for the people, by the people, and consumed by the people. We're interested in Billie Eilish, but we're also interested in local bands. We collect everything from handwritten music manuscripts to Billboard magazines. What makes us unique is that we don't focus on one genre, but rather embrace them all. We collect everything from polka to rap. If it's related to music, then we most likely have something that will aid your research, project, or personal passion. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. Our contact information is on the website, and you'll see a slide later in this if you want to contact us. So now that you know a little bit about the center, I would like to introduce Dr. Mike Alleyne, a professor in the Department of Recording Industry here at MTSU, and a visiting professor at the Pop Academy in Germany. Dr. Alleyne is an expert in many areas of popular music. He served as a consultant for the late Marvin Gaye's estate during its successful $5 million infringement lawsuit against the creators of the 2013 song Blurred Lines. Dr. Alleyne is also the co-organizer of the first popular music conference dedicated to the life and career of the artist Prince. He has interviewed such notables as Public Enemy rap icon Chuck D, Rolling Stones guitarist Ron Wood, and singer-songwriters Phil Collins and Billy Ocean. In 2020, Dr. Alleyne's book, The Essential Hendrix, an A-Z Compendium, was published, which focuses on the people and places associated with Jimi Hendrix during his life, but also focuses on Hendrix's enduring influence even 50 years after his death. Welcome, Dr. Alleyne. Thank you so much for being here. All right.
Thanks for having me.
And now I'll introduce our moderator, Katie Rainge-Briggs. Katie is a doctoral student in public history at MTSU. Before embarking on her graduate work, she was a social studies teacher in Los Angeles, California. While there, she helped develop the Responsible Indigenous Social Entrepreneurship School, or RISE, and developed a curriculum that helps students understand and share their cultural wealth. Her work earned her multiple grants, and she was named a Los Angeles Unified School District Common Core Fellow. Katie completed a curatorial residency at the National Museum of African American Music, which opened in September 2020 in downtown Nashville. Katie also worked as a graduate assistant here at the Center for Popular Music. Her presence at the center is very much missed.
Hello.
Welcome, Katie. Thank you so much for being here. And I am now going to pass the mic over to you, Katie.
Thank you very much. And thank you for allowing me to moderate this exciting conversation we'll have today.
Absolutely.
Dr. Alleyne, tell me about the design of your book. I'd like you to open up with that and especially think about describing to us the access points you provide for readers and why you decided to do it this way.
Well, I first wanted to make sure that everyone could see the fiery book cover. And now I'll try to answer your question. Okay. Yeah, the design of the book. Well, as is mentioned in the introduction, the book was conceived as an alternative means of looking at Hendrix's histories. Much of the layout and content of the book was informed by a decade that I spent, and I'm still spending, teaching a Jimi Hendrix special topics course at MTSU. And I could never find the textbook that I really wanted. There are many texts that are especially good in certain areas, but to try to provide an historical overview to students who only have fragmented knowledge of Hendrix, or in some cases maybe very little, I needed something that would allow not only for a generalized introduction, but that would also facilitate a deep immersion. And by having the encyclopedic layout, it makes it possible to segment parts of that exploration, because the more generalized narratives on Hendrix that I've read sometimes seem to lose some details and make broadly scattered references to people. And then by the end of the narrative, if you didn't already know who they were and who they played with, there's no information provided. So this was a way of attempting to integrate some of that data in a more meaningful way.
As a teacher and a public historian, I can see the material be accessible for a variety of age groups and for a variety of levels of understanding cultural history, which is something that I want you to go into, please. I noticed that you take some time to discuss the artists that Hendrix influenced. Can you describe that some more and why you decide to focus in on that?
Well, it's hard for us to understand the impact of Hendrix without referring to many of the artists who came later, who mirrored that influence and extended it, subsequently influencing other artists. It has been said, and I think accurately, that every electric guitarist who came after Hendrix has been influenced by him, either directly or indirectly. And this is part of the passage of that transmission of musical and artistic information. It's the idea that one guitarist influenced by him has an impact on some other player who then integrates elements of that style and tries to make it his or her own. But the seed of Hendrix's electrification is encased and immersed within that. And I'm thinking like, if we want specific examples, I'm thinking of people like Ernie Isley of the Isley Brothers and Eddie Hazel of Funkadelic. And these are players who really have not received the kind of historical recognition that they're due. I do have a separate entry in my book on the Isley Brothers because they, I think more than any other popular music group, particularly in the decade of Hendrix's death, did more to extend his legacy in popular music. And especially since black groups were not heavily associated with having electric rock-styled lead guitar in the front of the mix of the music in the way that the Isley Brothers did in the 1970s. They did their part to keep that legacy alive. And it's also of greater historical importance because Hendrix was a member of the Isley Brothers band between 1964 and 65. So this isn't just abstract inspiration. This is inspiration from someone who was in their band and whose legacy has a more direct connection than in most other cases.
So often when we read about Jimi Hendrix, we hear about him as an artist, a musician, but the cultural history, the social history about who he is and his identity is limited. And in your writing, you do make a point to connect this. Talk to us about your connecting of Jimi Hendrix and his identity and how it speaks to his art.
Well, how much time do we have? 3 hours? Well, context is always very important. We need social and historical context to better understand the creative expression that takes place at really any given point in popular music. But I think it's even more significant for the mid-1960s and all of the turbulence that was occurring, the civil rights struggle and the open racial conflict, the issue surrounding the rising deaths in the Vietnam War, the issue surrounding drug culture, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. And of course, we also have the ascendancy of Richard Nixon to the presidency. All of these are major social and political issues that influence the kind of art that is being made. So without that context, we tend to think of Hendrix perhaps as just an artist who made records and died one day. There was a lot more going on. And for Hendrix as a black male artist, as the leader of an internationally successful rock band at that time, that was really revolutionary in ways that we may not fully understand unless we have the full context. When we think of black artists at that time, those who were really successful, generally speaking, you had solo vocalists or groups of vocalists, but you didn't have a black guitarist at the front of a rock band. Yes, there were blues guitarists who had very electric sounds, but they never had the kind of commercial profile or success of Hendrix. And they were more closely rooted to tradition. Hendrix was a heavily blues-influenced musician, but he was not tied to that tradition, and spent a great deal of time and energy freeing himself, using it as a launching site, but freeing himself to explore soundscapes and sonic textures in ways that had not really been done in the same way in popular music.
How do you think the climate and culture in London might have facilitated this successful expression of Jimi Hendrix?
Interesting question. I grew up in London, and I was there when Hendrix arrived. Of course, I was too young to have actually have gone to see him. My parents would have had a fit. It's important because had Jimi Hendrix not left America at that point in 1966, well, indeed, he was taken from America to London, but had he not left, I doubt that we would be speaking about him now in the same context. America, musically, for a black male hippie lead electric guitarist with unconventional clothing and behavior, no chance for Jimi Hendrix to really break through. The only way that he became a figure in America was by going somewhere else, by going to London and being embraced in the scene there. Now, to get closer to answering your question, I think there was a greater cultural openness in London. I don't want to give the impression that in some way Britain was non-racist and some kind of utopian situation for people from all over the world. That was not the case. However, because I think of the reverence that they had for the blues, there was a sense that Hendrix brought an aura of authenticity with him, coming from America, playing the way that he did, but also playing freely enough to take it in a different direction that would appeal to the audiences, the youth audiences of the time. So he was almost being commercial by accident, simply by following his creative muse. But there was an openness. And of course, it didn't hurt that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were enamored with Hendrix's music and style and actively promoted him as the real thing, as an authentic artist who had something sensational to contribute. So that opened the doors as well. But the fact was that there was this sense of acceptance of Jimi Hendrix.
There is a discussion about, in your writing, about his internalized antagonism. Describe that in relationship to your response about his acceptance in London and his barriers around race in the United States. How did this internalized antagonism how do we see it in his career, in his early part of his career, and how do we see it later in his music?
Well, you know, the first part of that antagonism, I think, comes from his unstable family life. The conflicts between his parents, the early divorce, the alcoholism, the early death of his mother while he was still a teenager. These all contributed to a sense of, for want of a better term, spiritual vacancy, a sense of absence and a sense of frustration. Plus, there was significant poverty. So he had to grapple with a number of minuses in his life. Then when he began playing as a sideman, he was always forced to contain his creative impulses. He wasn't allowed to stretch into radical solos that didn't fit the R&B mold. The only time that he seems to have had that opportunity on a regular basis was playing with the Isley Brothers, interestingly enough. And Hendrix did specifically talk about that sense of liberation that he had playing with them, having the opportunity to express himself and play solos. Yes, it worked for the band too, but it worked for him. So he didn't really have that many opportunities for the kind of creative expression that he had in mind. Now, when he does get to London and things start to take off, I think perhaps when we look at that point of history, we often forget that he was operating within an exploitative music industry framework, and that the management he was under really used him as a commodity rather than an artist. And Hendrix never got the kind of financial rewards that he was due for the work that he created. So that too would create another level of antagonism and frustration when you're pouring your creative heart out and the returns that you're getting are very limited. And we have to remember that the tour booking in those days was extremely chaotic. So Hendrix would be in the middle of cutting an album with The Experience, and then they'd have to leave the studio to keep their financial boat afloat and go halfway across the country for one gig, whether it was England or the US, and then go to the other side for the next gig. All of this creates a sense of disorientation and, in Hendrix's case, disillusionment, dissatisfaction with his life. And we see it coming out in a number of ways. I mean, we certainly hear it in many of his solos, but we also have these seemingly out of character tales of him damaging hotel rooms and being engaged in sudden fits of violent behavior. And I think, again, in terms of context, we have to look at all of that history to try to understand where this is coming from.
So what I'm hearing you talk about is how so much of his lived experiences is coloring his sound, which makes me think about the psychedelic sound that he pioneered. Would you agree that he pioneered psychedelic sound? And that's an assertion I'm getting from one of your chapters. Can you go into that?
Well, yes, it should be said that Hendrix was very reluctant to have his music categorized as psychedelic, or anything for that matter, because he wanted to avoid anything that could be perceived as a convenient box for stylistic genres. So in some ways, any discussion of Hendrix's music as psychedelic is at odds with his own perception of it. Having said that, however, his music did represent the time in which it was made and picked up on a lot of impulses from that era, certainly in terms of sound and soundscape and the creative impulse to explore sound in popular music in ways that people had not been doing previously. That was evident with a number of artists. I suppose Pink Floyd in their very early days would be an example. And they did appear on several bills with Hendrix too in London. So there's a direct connection there as well. And the sound, I think, is the primary vehicle of what we would like to describe as psychedelia related to Hendrix's music, but it's in the lyrics too. For example, if we look at his many references to color in Bold as Love on the Axis album, we get a sense of the kind of philosophical exploration that characterizes the era and is fused with this more exploratory approach to sound. And that unified with electricity and a kind of pioneering energy, I think that creates what we think of as psychedelia. But from Hendrix's point of view, he was just doing his thing. I should also probably mention that his physical appearance, his clothing, and his hairstyle, all of these were parts of that psychedelic aura, we can call it that. Hendrix just wanted to do something different. And I think he knew that if he was going to go to England and be successful, he had to stand out. And I think he also realized that the best way to stand out was to be his authentic self, and that's what he was actually doing. I don't think it was a commercial calculation to dress a certain way and sound a certain way. He just wanted to be authentic and express himself, and that became part of the situation. I suppose as well, we could suggest that Hendrix's blackness was a vehicle in some ways for a less mainstream kind of artistic expression. By that I mean that when we look at the influences on the British bands, the blues and jazz artists, we're talking about Black American sources. And if anyone was going to be psychedelic, it was going to be a Black American musician. As well as the progressive rock English bands who were starting to spring up, who themselves were influenced by that music.
Why do you say that if anyone was going to be psychedelic, it would be the Black artist?
Well, the thing is that Black artists, certainly up to that time, had a history of having to operate outside of mainstream frameworks. Yes, there were artists who functioned within them, but in a very limited way. In terms of what people would consider to be authentic artistic expression, that was not confined by the marketplace or the preferences of radio, but that prioritized the artist's need to purge themselves of whatever demons they were carrying or whatever creative ideas they had. That was where you'd find it. Now, people will also say, well, if you look at experimentation among white artists like John Cage, you had other kinds of sonic exploration, but it was another kind. It didn't have the same kind of intensity and socio-political anguish embedded in it. And I think that, I think that plays a big role in making the art more angular and less commercial.
The authentic expression, the concept of mixing identity with this sonic expression makes me think of another artist in a different genre, and that's Miles Davis. Talk to us about that relationship, Hendrix, and his production or his art is connected to Miles Davis's creation of art, his art.
Well, that's another question that could lead us on a 5-hour discussion. But, well, we know that Miles was already turned on to Hendrix's sound before Hendrix passed away. And as I believe the story goes, guitarist John McLaughlin, who was playing with Miles Davis at the time, British guitarist John McLaughlin, who is still around and creating some great music, he took Miles Davis to see the Monterey Pop Festival film. Hendrix made his first American appearance as a solo act at Monterey Pop in '67. And of course, in his efforts to make a memorable impact on the American audience, he pulled out all the stops and burned his guitar at the end of the performance and smashed it up. But of course, preceding that was a display of profound musical flamboyance that made its own impression before all of the other theatrics took over. So when Miles Davis encountered that music, both in seeing the Monterey Pop Festival and also from the urgings of his wife, Betty Davis, his wife at the time, who really pushed the Hendrix sound towards Miles, he began to conceptualize some other possibilities. Now, I think he was already going in those kinds of directions anyway, and we know that he was listening to James Brown and Sly and the Family Stone too. But Hendrix embodied something that Miles could relate to. I think the essence was already in Miles. It was just trying to find a vehicle for further expressing that. So that made a big impact. And I think when we think of the jazz rock fusion era and some of the music that we hear, for example, on Miles's Bitches Brew album from 1970, we begin to get a sense of that influence. Of course, there's the apocryphal tale of Miles and Jimi Hendrix supposed to have been that were supposed to collaborate, and allegedly money issues put an end to that prospect. And maybe it's a good thing, because I'm not sure we would have been ready for what came out of that particular collaboration. It would have been too much. But Miles definitely could see some degree of creative kinship, perhaps in a way that he also envisioned that later on with Prince, even though their collaborations too never took full fruit. He could see that there was something that they shared on an artistic level, and maybe on a social level too, as black artists who were in the foreground, who needed to create even more space for their artistic expression.
I want to go back to something we discussed earlier, especially after having heard you say Black artist and artistic expression. You mentioned Hendrix and his physical style and the point of him expressing himself through his style of clothing. That's a part of your book. Tell me why you decided to talk about fashion and music.
Well, I suppose there are a number of possible answers to that, but I think it was important to take a very holistic perspective on the era and the influences. And I think when we leave out any one of those components, whether it's the politics or the clothing or the technology, we start to lose the thread, the vehicles that made it possible for the lasting cultural impact that's associated with the music. You know, if we went back and looked through those photos of history of Hendrix as a sideman with Curtis Knight and the Squires, or the Isley Brothers, or with Wilson Pickett, you know, he's wearing the suit and the tie. That's not the Hendrix we know. So something happens between the first half of the 60s and the second half with him and his consciousness. And the clothing is part of the external representation of that. It's the liberation is the freeing of self that is reflected in the music as well. That's the thing. There's a direct relationship between the fashion persona and the musical persona. So it was important to incorporate Hendrix's tendencies to have clashing colors and paradoxical pieces of clothing that somehow reflected what he was doing with sound.
You just told us something happened while he was on tour with those specific bands in the early 60s. This is also a time period Hendrix is in Nashville. Tell us more about Hendrix in Nashville, since we are in Tennessee.
Yes, indeed. Well, Hendrix talked a lot about experiences, social experiences that he had in Nashville. I mean, we have to just put this in historical context and mention that he was in the Army in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, leaving in 1962. And then he and his future bassist in the band of Gypsies, Billy Cox, were playing together and commuting regularly between Clarksville and Nashville. So a large part of Hendrix's formative musical identity was actually built right here in Tennessee. And in some ways it's problematic because a lot of the historical narratives don't make much out of it. Because we only think of London as the primary launch site, which it was for his solo career. But in terms of building towards that point where he could feel confident enough to go across the ocean, across the Atlantic, Nashville plays a crucial role. And Hendrix does talk about race conflict in Nashville and going to restaurants where blacks would not be served. He had talked about doing that with Billy Cox. And also, instances of racial insults being thrown at him. So Nashville impacts on Hendrix in musical and cultural and psychological ways. And that's an area that's ripe for further exploration. Although finding the people who can speak to that with authority is more difficult with the passage of time. So, a lot of people don't know that Hendrix loved all music, including country music. And he would listen to the Grand Ole Opry and learn to play those guitar parts too. So his musical vocabulary is a lot more complicated and varied than perhaps we give him credit for. So Nashville provides, the blues and R&B influences in the area, but also some of the country and more pop-styled influences. And these are things that Hendrix took on the road when he would frequently depart from Nashville in order to get a gig somewhere else, whether it was with Little Richard or the Isleys. And on those tours, he would expand that vocabulary and then come back to Nashville and then assimilate more. So this turned out to be a very crucial site for his creative development. But as I suggest, one that also had an impact on his vision of the world and social conflict.
What are some musical examples of his that demonstrate his geographic diversity, the relationships that influence him, the diverse relationships that influence him? Thinking about our recent conversation. I know there are a lot, but
there certainly are. There certainly are. I have a certain preference for late era Hendrix. Generally, if you see a documentary on television or any compressed account of Hendrix, 9 times out of 10, they're going to talk about the first 3 albums. That's between 67 and 68. And you'll hear references to all of the same tracks: Hey Joe, Purple Haze, Little Wing, etc. But it tends to overshadow things that he did between 1969 and 70. And of course, a lot of that music only came out after his death. But I think that there's a sense of greater creative expansion that characterizes what comes later. We have to remember that when Hendrix recorded Are You Experienced in 1967, Axis Boulder's Love the same year, and then Electric Ladyland, at least parts of Electric Ladyland, because that was an experimental double album, most of the time he was under the thumb of the English producer Chas Chandler, and the scope for his experimentation was always being limited by the commercial and financial realities of dealing with studio time. And it really wasn't until after that phase that he began to fully explore his creative possibilities. Now, it's true that we do hear a lot of things happening on Electric Ladyland as a double album, although I would controversially argue that that record might have been stronger had it been a single record, but that's another discussion that we can't get into now. So I think that we actually hear a more meditative approach to what Hendrix is doing on some songs. And I'm going to try to select a portion of one of those pieces, because when we look at the first posthumous albums released, Hendrix dies in September 1970, and then in 1971 we have The Cry of Love, which is probably one of the best of the first posthumous releases. And then we have the Rainbow Bridge album. Now, it sounds like I'm rambling a bit here, but what I'm moving towards is the fact that many of the first releases that emerged after Hendrix's death later became the basis of a 1997 release, First Rays of the New Rising Sun, which Hendrix was alleged to have been working on at the time of his death. He had this grand vision for what could have been a double or triple album. No one knows for sure. But the material that would have been on this one work then got scattered across several different works until they were all reunited later. So what I'm going to play is a song called Hey Baby, New Rising Sun, and just part of the intro, because I think it represents a part of what could be viewed as a deeper stylistic, artistic, meditational approach to his art that we don't hear in the same way in 1967 or 68. So I will just play a little excerpt from that. So in that we get a different flavor of Hendrix that is not the same in character as what we hear in the early days of his solo career.
I appreciate this taking us to his early days of his career and then bringing us through his career, especially into the 70s. What you do, though, see is his influence in rock and what rock looks like and sounds like decades later. Could you help assert examples of that?
Oh, yes. Well, if we look certainly at the black rock group Living Colour and the guitar work of their lead player, Vernon Reid, we have a direct connection to the Hendrix legacy. And Vernon Reid, incidentally, also appears in a number of Hendrix-related documentaries. So I'm not talking in theoretical abstract terms. It's something he recognizes himself as part of his very wide vocabulary. but one that is related directly to Jimi Hendrix. Of course, Hendrix would probably be greatly alarmed to think that in the 21st century, the idea of a black rock band is still some kind of industry novelty, as it was in 1988 when Living Colour seemed to break through and started to have a major commercial impact with the Vivid album. I might be a little off with the specific year of release here, but the point is that albums like Vivid and artists like Prince would not have happened in the same way without Jimi Hendrix's legacy existing before them. I think those artists are talented enough to have succeeded in some way anyway, but Hendrix exploded a number of musical myths and exploded a number of boundaries and barriers for black artists who did not fit stereotypical molds. And with Living Colour, I think we get a great sense of that. Also, there's the fact that black rock groups bring their own degree of groove and funkiness to the genre. And much of that goes back to Hendrix's Band of Gypsies in 1970 with Buddy Miles and Billy Cox. You know, an all-black rock trio in 1970, another revolution. You just did not see them on the landscape, and certainly not in the foreground attached to one of the major rock stars of the era. So there are a lot of different ways of looking at that. And then, of course, there's the whole string of Isley Brothers albums in the 1970s in particular, and Ernie Isley's solo album.
And so how do you also see this influencing just general music and how artists are now allowed, or do you see artists now be allowed to be freer in expression? How did he, listening to you, it sounds like he opened doors, busted open doors. Do you see these doors being opened to artists to produce the things they're producing? And what does that sound like?
Well, I think that perhaps where we are now, we need more artists in the mainstream who are able to capitalize on those possibilities, because we are in an era of exceptional commercialization that does not always provide an opportunity for more creative approaches to reach the mainstream. In my history of the recording industry class, for example, I'm always pointing out that when we look at the jazz rock fusion era sparked off by Miles Davis and in a sense indirectly by Hendrix, we have albums that were very intense and very creative that were in the top 20 in the charts and getting gold certification. That doesn't happen now. So that's part of the difference that we're dealing with. There are always artists who fit the description that you're talking about on the fringe and who have their constituencies. But I think the difference between then and now is that at that point, they were far more visible. Now we have to search much harder to find them.
Is there something that you would like an educator to know about how they could teach about Hendrix and placing him with the complexity of history, social and political, and have that access with your writing, which I want to go back to when we opened up, which is the accessibility point. You take a whole bunch of information and lay it out so that folks could get chunks of information quickly, and the novice has the opportunity to almost witness what you witnessed in archives and in life and the collection of research you've done. But in the end, our discussion today was definitely supported by you feeling comfortable in this research. How would your book help facilitate an educator to tell a more robust history about Hendrix because of its layout?
Well, it does allow for that very segmented exploration. You know, I've talked a lot about the Isley Brothers, whose history I'm very familiar with, not just as a researcher, but as someone who bought those albums in the 1970s as well. So if we don't have that kind of focus history, for example, if we only have one paragraph that says, Hendrix was influenced, his influence was evident in the work of the Isley Brothers, that's not enough. We have to have the before, during, and after, and the fact that they were one of the first bands, to cover Hendrix's music after his death, and actually called his name during the recording so that everyone would know that the song came from Jimi Hendrix. So the totality of the histories, the individual histories, becomes very important to expanding the depth of the influence and for facilitating an understanding of the scope of Hendrix's greater impact.
Well, I appreciate your facilitation of this deeper understanding personally as a student of history and as someone who is inspired by music, moved by music, and feels as though it does tell a narrative and becomes a primary source in history. Thank you for this discussion, this dialogue about Hendrix.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I'm going to come back on and close us out. Again, thank you, Dr. Alleyne and Katie, so much for sharing your time, expertise, and passion with us. It's so easy to think of Hendrix as this like super cool rock god who didn't like experience the difficulties of just, being like a person in the world. But after reading the book and listening to this conversation, I'm really thinking about Hendrix's drive to be his authentic self and how difficult that must have been, but also how memorable. So I don't know, just really cool to think about, and I really, really appreciate this conversation. So if anyone out there would like to continue the conversation, please feel free to email us questions or comments at popular.music@mtsu.edu. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending our program, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.